Imagine an American car brand that matters more to China today than it does to America itself. A brand that slowly lost buyers at home, but thousands of miles away became a symbol of success. And this is not Tesla, not Cadillac either. This is Buick, the same Buick that by the end of the 20th century was increasingly seen in the United States as a car for older buyers. Younger customers were turning away from the brand, and it seemed entirely possible that Buick could one day join the long list of vanished American marks. While Americans were moving to Japanese and German cars, Chinese buyers were buying hundreds of thousands of Buicks a year and effectively helping the brand survive. One of the key roles in this story was not played by a luxury sedan or an expensive SUV, but by a perfectly ordinary minivan built on a mass-market GM platform. Today, I will tell the story of why China fell in love with Buick, how an ordinary American minivan became a Chinese status symbol, and whether China really saved this brand from oblivion. It is hard to believe, but Buick's history in China did not begin in the 1990s. It began almost a century ago, back in the 1920s. China at the time was poor, fragmented, and deeply unstable. But in major cities, especially Shanghai, a class of very wealthy people was growing quickly. And for them, a car was not just transportation. It was a sign of status. Cars were bought by officials, generals, foreign businessmen, and extremely rich families. And Buick fit that audience almost perfectly: prestigious, expensive, American, and visible enough to make a statement. In Shanghai, the Buick E44 convertible was considered a top-class car. And according to figures often cited in accounts of Buick's early history in China, by 1931, in every 6 cars on the city's roads was a Buick. But the numbers were not the most important part. What mattered just as much was who chose the brand. Buick was owned by China's last emperor, Puyi, by Sun Yat-sen, often called the father of modern China, by Sung Mei-ling, and by other figures from the very top of Chinese history. For General Motors itself, China was certainly not a market on the scale of America. Compared with sales in the United States, the numbers were modest. But for Buick, China became an important source of prestige outside the US. The brand was associated not just with cars, but with money, power, and China's urban elite. That story was interrupted by the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Second World War, and the Communist victory in 1949. Private car ownership almost disappeared from the country, and the automobile became not something people bought, but a state-controlled resource. American marques were replaced by Soviet cars and other cars from the socialist bloc, while Buick's history in China was put on pause for decades. For GM, leaving China after 1949 was an unpleasant episode, but not a disaster. China was still a small car market, and General Motors was making its real money at home, in America. Business in the US was going extremely well. Inside GM's hierarchy, Buick occupied a very comfortable position, above Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile, but below Cadillac. It was not a cheap mass-market car, but it was not top-tier luxury either. Buick was chosen by someone who had already made it, wanted comfort, status, and solidity, but did not necessarily want to move up to Cadillac. In the 1960s, the brand fit American car culture very well. The Riviera became one of the most stylish, personal luxury cars of its era, and the lineup also included the Skylark, Electra, and LeSabre. These were big, confident, comfortable cars with the right dose of chrome and presence. Buick was a normal symbol of successful America. Not the most expensive, not the flashiest, but prestigious enough to make its owner feel that he had moved beyond an ordinary Chevrolet. Over time, that formula began to age. America was changing, buyers were changing. Japanese and European brands were putting more pressure on the market, and Buick increasingly held on to the image of a big, soft, conservative car. It still sold plenty of vehicles, but younger buyers were less and less likely to see anything desirable in it. By the early 2000s, it no longer seemed impossible that GM might one day simply shut Buick down, just as it had shut down other brands before and would shut down more later. In America, Buick was slowly turning into a brand without a future. But Buick had an ace up its sleeve, one that the vast majority of Americans did not even know existed. The key moment came in 1997, when Shanghai GM was established in China as a joint venture between General Motors and the Chinese state-owned company SAIC Motor. Today, this looks like the beginning of a huge story, but at the time, few people in the automotive world saw it as a move that would change Buick's fate. In the 1990s, China was still only beginning to gather momentum. Its car market was small, and compared with the United States, Europe, and Japan, it looked almost secondary. By then, Volkswagen had understood China's potential better than most. It had entered the market earlier than many of its rivals, and had already built a strong position there, especially thanks to the Santana. I've already made a separate video about that story, and I will leave the link in the pinned comment. GM decided to build its Chinese strategy around Buick, and from the outside that choice could look more than a little strange. It would have seemed far more logical to bring an affordable Chevrolet or even a European Opel to what was still a relatively poor Chinese market. But GM made that decision deliberately. China's car market in the late 1990s was not yet a mass market. For an ordinary Chinese buyer, a new car was still extremely expensive, and the main customers were officials, wealthy entrepreneurs, company executives, and state institutions. In other words, exactly the kind of audience for whom a car was not just transportation, but a sign of status. And in China, that kind of image had already been attached to Buick since the first half of the 20th century. The joint venture's first model arrived in 1998, the Buick New Century. It was not an independent Chinese development, but a local market version of the sixth-generation American Buick Century. Early production had a very low level of localization. In practice, it was CKD assembly from kits supplied from the United States. The New Century did not become a huge mass-market hit, but it did its job. It proved to GM's management that Buick could be sold in China not as a strange American brand, but as a respectable mark. And then came the real turning point in Buick's Chinese history. In 1999, Buick introduced the GL8 in China, the first minivan in the brand's history. On paper, it was a fairly ordinary minivan, based on GM's U-body family, which had been launched in the late 1990s and sold by several General Motors divisions under different brands. Choosing a minivan for the Chinese market and building it locally was not an obvious move. It is still not entirely clear whether what happened next was the result of a precise GM strategy or simply a fortunate accident. In the United States, minivans by that point were primarily family vehicles. People bought them for trips with children, grocery runs, weekends out of town, or vacations. In American culture, this class of vehicle had almost nothing to do with prestige or status. A minivan was practical, but it was not something people showed off. In China, that image had not yet formed. There was no established idea of the minivan as a family car, and there was almost none of the customer base that supported this segment in the United States. Formerly, the GL8 was positioned as a luxury minivan, probably with wealthy families and corporate buyers in mind. But already in 2000, just a year after the GL8 entered production, it became clear that Chinese buyers were using the vehicle in a completely different way from what Americans had imagined. The GL8 found a niche that barely existed in the United States. Not a family minivan for parents with children, but a business vehicle for bosses, officials, meetings, hotels, airports, and VIP transport. A minivan that looked ordinary by American standards was seen in China as a prestigious office on wheels. Once GM understood that, the positioning was quickly adjusted. The GL8 was not the only Buick on the Chinese market, and it was not responsible for most of the brand's sales, but it helped pull Buick's prestige upward. While Buick sales were falling in the United States, they were rising in China. While the brand was fading into the background in America, Buick was becoming desirable and prestigious in China. The growth was enormous. In 2000, Buick sold just 9,983 vehicles in China. By 2010, that number had grown to an incredible 543,000. For comparison, in 2009, Buick sold only about 102,000 vehicles in the United States. After numbers like that, it became clear that China was no longer just a successful overseas market for the brand. It had effectively become Buick's lifeline. In 2005, the minivan received an update that mainly affected the exterior and interior. But the previous version was not taken out of production. It remained available to order, received a weaker 2.5-liter engine, and kept the old interior. In effect, Buick kept two versions of the same idea on the market, a more expensive and prestigious one for major clients and a more accessible one for the less expensive corporate segment. The first-generation GL8, together with its periodically updated versions, stayed in production until 2010, when an all-new generation of the minivan appeared in China. The new generation of the GL8 appeared in 2010 and essentially confirmed the model's new status. Technically, it still relied on the old foundation and used some of the previous hardware, but in appearance and purpose, it was already a different vehicle. It was not being shaped as a family minivan for an American suburb, but as a vehicle built around China's idea of status, more presence, more comfort, and more attention paid to the passengers in the back. After that, the GL8 story becomes a little confusing, but there is no real need to go through every generation and index. The important part is different. GM was no longer simply trying to sell an American minivan to Chinese buyers. It was building an entire lineup around the GL8. Older versions were not removed from the market right away. They were kept as more affordable options, while the newer versions moved further upscale, with richer interiors, captain's chairs, dedicated VIP trims, and increasingly premium positioning. The peak of this direction was the GL8 Century, an ultra-luxury Buick for the Chinese market that is now hard to connect with the image of an ordinary family minivan. Buick reached its peak in China in 2016, when the brand sold about 1.23 million vehicles there. After that, sales began to decline, mainly because of growing pressure from local Chinese brands. Even so, China remains Buick's most important market. In the United States, the brand's position is more difficult. Today, Buick's American lineup consists of several crossovers, and the talk that the brand could one day disappear from the U.S. market has never really gone away. But China makes that story less straightforward. If Buick is at risk of disappearing anywhere, the first place to look is America, because China is still the market that gives the brand the scale and status it lost long ago at home.